Well, in its explanation for its change in the outlook on Friday, ratings agency Moody said the challenges that government faces are evident in the continued deterioration in South Africa's trend in growth and public debt burden, despite ongoing policy processes. State-owned enterprises, in particular Eskom, were singled out, with the agency saying that government will not find the political capital to implement the range of measures it intended, and its plans will largely be ineffective in lifting growth. Well, that is a grim picture, and to discuss it, I'm joined in the studio by the man who's in the hot seat, Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan. Minister, you did not expect a different view from Moody's despite Tito Mbowene's prayers, did you?
Yeah, no, but it does give us an opportunity to do better in the next year, to give effect to our plans. And where I disagree with Moody is in some sectors the political capital is certainly there, as well as the ideas, to bring about the changes that are necessary. Eskom is one example. Spectrum is another example. The mining charter is a third. Helping small businesses is a fourth. And if we make a few more determined efforts on certain of the administered prices in about a year to 18 months, we'll begin to see differences, which means that the cost of doing business will be lower. So there are opportunities for us, and just like the Springboks yesterday, if we take our opportunities and score the tries, then we'll emerge as victors. If we, on the other hand, squander our opportunities, and that's not left to one person, people in the executive, it depends on all of us. Those of us who are trying to trip this process and make sure that it doesn't happen, as well as those of us who have the responsibility to make it happen. But at the end of the day, I think the opportunities are there. The roadmap is clear as far as Eskom is concerned. We hope to do a similar thing for Transnet shortly, to make sure that the logistics that we provide, both in terms of rail and in terms of ports, is cost effective to our businesses. And if we can succeed on some of these fronts, by actually getting things done and having proof that we're actually getting these things done, we can still emerge with a much more optimistic picture in a year's time.
Now, there has been a tendency to want to have quick fixes for very deep systemic challenges, and you've been at pains to remind people of the depth of the rot, the challenges of getting things and keeping things going, and also planning for the future. So I want to put a graph up on the screen where we just put the issue into context. And you can have a look, Minister. Now, of course, there are you, the shareholder, the public enterprises. We've got Treasury, we've got DTI, Environmental Affairs, Water, we've got Energy, we've got NERSA. One of the things that a lot of rating agencies say is that these institutions don't often speak off the same page. And people wonder whether you guys are sitting in the same cabinet meeting. What can you tell us about the cooperative way in which you are trying to solve this problem, and how much does it depend on government actually functioning as a unit rather than people working in silos and in isolation?
Well, the paper itself is a product of cooperation. So if you look at different segments in the paper, the integrated resource plan comes from the Department of Energy, and that's, if you like, the baseline for the energy future for the next 10 years and the kind of mix we're going to get in terms of energy sources. The Department of Public Enterprises steered this process in terms of structure, governance, the business model, and the kind of path of change that we're going to actually follow. The National Treasury has participated on the financial side, some of which the Deputy Minister pointed out. But it goes beyond that as well, because now, having gone through the budget pronouncements, we have to, and there's a lot of misunderstanding around this, that you can just pull out a rabbit from the hat, as some of the Sunday columnists think, and voila, you have a solution to the debt. But there are definite scientific processes, if you can call them that we have to follow. and the Treasury, amongst others, will be doing that shortly. If you look at environmental affairs, the concept of the just transition, the energy transition, meeting the requirements of the minimum emissions standards that we are obliged to meet, all of those work together. For Eskom to work, mineral resources needs to work with us, and we have started that work, talking to the coal miners and saying, make your share of the contribution to reducing the cost structure in Eskom. Similarly, coal mines and Eskom itself requires water in the different parts of the country, and that's where the water department comes in. But the primary departments have been collaborating, and the paper is the evidence of that. And of course, as we go on with the implementation process, each of us will have to contribute to our share. So we certainly sit in the same room. The paper reflects the same narrative, and we'll take responsibility both collectively and individually to make sure that we get things done. Eskom is too important for the country and for the economy and for households for us to allow it to fail, as the President said, both last year and this year.
Well, talking about households, let's look at municipalities, because that is one of your major challenges. And I'm going to ask our technical team to put it up here. It's got the breakdown of the top municipalities and Soweto, the debt that is there. Now, those figures are quite staggering. Now, the call has been made for those who can pay to pay. You yourself said at your press conference that the indigent is catered for. How do you change the mindset of communities that have historically not paid as a way to resist apartheid rule, to now accept that we are in this together, that we are a democracy, and that people should pay for services?
Well, in the first instance, mayors and councillors must take political responsibility for each of these areas, and they must make sure that the administration, which is the second component in a municipality, that collects the money, actually hands over the money and does not start using what people pay for electricity to buy expensive cars or to squander it on one or other event or expense that they actually engage in. In the second instance, we always blame the community, but the interlocutor between community and Eskom is the administration and the political office bearers in these municipalities. And in many of them, there have been graphic examples of corrupt practices in one form or another. Some of them, while I was at Cocta, I know actually had sound administrations in place, good revenue collection systems in place. In comes a political force, disrupts all of that, because as you were pointing out a little earlier, some patronage needs to be handed out to somebody. Now, it's those people who have benefited from this patronage that could well become a vested interest that we need to understand better.
Minister, I'm worried a little bit. You were reading my mind. I was going to remind you that you were the Cocta Minister for a very short time until you were called back to take over finances. But the reality is that our political system in many instances in municipalities is broken due to patronage, and it is due to the lack of consequence management. Now, the Auditor General, yourself, the Treasury have all put in place mechanisms. Why have we not seen people arrested? Why have we not seen municipal managers, mayors being arrested? Instead, what we are seeing is the killing of councillors as we get closer to the next municipal election, which is, of course, in about 20 months or so.
Because some of our systems don't work, whilst others half work and yet others work fully. So whether we like it or not, the investigating arm of the state is not public enterprises or Cocta, it's the detectives in the police and in the Hawks. So get them here to account for what's happening. Secondly, the prosecutions, I think, are making every effort, from what we hear, to rebuild their capacity. So we must re-emphasize the point that you made earlier on. State capture wasn't just about stealing money. State capture is now a systemic cancer and disease. It spreads from head to toe. And people think that, you know, there's this narrative among some so-called market forces. Leave the boards and they can do whatever they do, and if you say anything, then you're interfering, which is absolute nonsense on the one hand, and on the other hand, doesn't have any understanding of the complexities of removing this virus or cancer or state capture from both the mindsets and the culture that has emerged in these institutions. So I imagine that some people are going to find themselves pretty soon in the dock, and then we'll begin to see a new narrative. And all of us, I think, want to see that happening sooner rather than later, because as you correctly point out, if there's no consequences, and those consequences is what people want to avoid, by getting into all sorts of fancy stuff. And
there are no shortcuts. I mean, people must actually be held accountable.
And we're a country that believes in the rule of law.
Yes.
Right? So we've got to patiently wait for some of this.
So moving Eskom from crisis to stability, if we can get that graph up. And essentially it speaks about how you plan on doing that. Because you can't just fix Eskom and forget that the lights must still be put on every day. So you are having to change a moving ship, which is, of course, never an easy thing to do. Take us through how you are dealing with the immediate problems, the medium-term problems, and then those long-term problems or challenges that's going to give us the security that we need, which is what investors are actually looking for if they are going to be putting money into this country.
So in the first instance, we need a clear idea of where we're going, the vision. And the vision is dictated partly by our own circumstances, but partly by very dynamic changes that are happening within the energy and electricity industry globally. So, for example, the shift from national grids to local grids, the shift from fossil fuels to renewables in one form or another. But this migration doesn't happen overnight. It happens over sometimes a period of 10 to 20 years. The second is the institutional form, or the business model that these utilities are taking shape in various parts of the world. And again, from the few studies that we have done, the indicators are these are long, tough processes that can take 10 years or more. What we are doing now through the paper is putting South Africa on that path of changing the way Eskom works, but the way Eskom is shaped as well. So on your left-hand side, you'll see the different types of generators.
Yes.
Eskom generation, independent power producers. SAPP refers to the South African power pool because we are connected with our neighbors. These are peaking plants that are within Eskom, which are used from time to time, and other refers to even sometimes borrowing power from large power users, where we call them POTS within the Eskom circumstances. The blue is the transmission component. That's what actually takes energy from a power station and takes it to a municipality, takes it to a smelter, or takes it to a large manufacturing business.
And that's where you've had your big challenges. That's where you've had
transmission
a lot of
has been more or less stable. The big challenges are in Eskom generation. Right? And then on the right-hand side is distribution. So you have Eskom. So we have a very odd situation where half the country, plus minus, is served by Eskom directly. Half the country is served through municipalities, although the Constitution says that they have the exclusive power to reticulate electricity, but not all of the municipalities have the capability to actually do so. So those two are the major ones. The embedded reference there is where some municipalities are becoming innovative. They are producing, for example, small amounts of electricity through biomass and through other things that are available within their particular localities. So we are now talking about changing Eskom from generation, transmission, and distribution all belonging to one house, so to speak, to a situation where you have Eskom Holdings as a sort of umbrella company. Within it, you have generation, and hopefully you'll put up the diagram which shows that we've taken an innovative step in South Africa by saying that Eskom generation is actually a monopoly of sorts because it produces 95% of the power we actually use at the moment. But what we want to introduce there through clustering the different power stations
is some level of competition.
Is competition to keep people on their toes, to make sure that ultimately it's the citizens and the businesses that benefit from the cost effectiveness of what we actually have.
But when you mention the name competition, people automatically think privatization. And when people think privatization, they think loss of jobs. Now, this question of a just transition has been on the table for a long time. And just as Tito Mboweni has to have some tough talk with unions, you too will going to have some tough talk. What is the pain that people are going to have to take for us to introduce this competition? And how do we make sure that competition is not just something that benefits profits, but also benefits workers, is also a job generator and creator?
Well, in the first instance, competition is about efficiency. It's about saying that you must stop spending money in a way in which you think the fiscus is always going to bail you out, which is what South Africans want to see. And so you want an efficient purchasing of coal, you want efficient usage of your maintenance capabilities, you want your original equipment manufacturers to provide services at the right kind of cost. And for many years now, in those and many other areas, there are excessive costs that Eskom is bearing, and then you and I, as citizens, are required to pay what is called a cost-reflective tariff. So we want to look into those costs, as the Treasury is saying as well, and begin to dissect them and find more opportunities to save costs. Secondly, this is not about privatization. That's a hoax that is being raised in the hope that we will be able to keep everything as it is, but still think it's going to become efficient, and somebody's going to come and solve the problem of debt. So let me emphasize, this is not privatization.
But let's be honest. We have monopolies.
I hope I haven't been dishonest.
No. Let's be honest about monopolies. Monopolies is not just particular to
the private sector.
The private sector.
Absolutely.
The public sector also has it, and it creates inefficiency.
We said so. The paper says so. We said so when we released the paper.
So why can't you convince the unions?
No. We have been talking to the unions before now. We've talked to the unions prior to the launch of this paper, and we'll be talking at various levels with the unions from this point onwards. But let's come to your latter point about the just transition. And that is about two things. One is the energy transition, and the second is what happens to workers when a power station closes down, or you get a shift in technology from a coal-powered station to a solar-powered facility, for example. And the key there is, and it's in the paper, we're saying, can we work together with the community, with the trade unions, with business, so that we can produce a model for looking after jobs so that nobody needs to be fired?
When are we going to have a new CEO for Eskom?
Within the next few days.
And within the next few days. So a lot of names have been bandied around. Mark Barnes is one of them.
I don't think this is the forum where you bandy about names.
I know, but let's talk about the characteristics of that CEO, because a lot of people are saying put in there people who know what they're doing and let the politicians not interfere. So what characteristics must this person have?
Firstly, in the current context, the right leadership qualities, some ability to relate to the business itself, and awareness of some of the financial issues that we are confronted with, the courage to bring about the tough changes that need to be brought about, the ability to talk to all the stakeholders and bring them on board. Of course, all of us will have that responsibility, and to have the staying power. It's going to require staying power, because that individual or set of individuals we begin to put together will obviously face all sorts of pressures from vested interests of one kind or another. So you've got to have staying power and the courage to bring about the changes that need to happen in a constructive, inclusive way in which everybody comes out as beneficiaries. But we can only do that if we work together, just like the Springboks yesterday. And
appointing, of course, the right person with the right skill set. Minister, thank you so very much for your input. We wait with bated breath who is going to be in that very difficult and challenging position of running the power utility of South Africa. It's time now, of course, to take a short break. When we come back, we take a look at what's made newspaper headlines, apart from the Springboks lifting that Rugby World Cup. Stay with us.